Well, I'm doing a little bit of cabinet construction. It's been quite a while since I've done any cabinet building, but I'm into it again a little bit. And these cabinets are made out of oak veneer plywood with edge banding. Up here, got 1.5 by 3/4 band, and the shelves down here have a 1/4 band on it right there. I need to build some doors for this. This is a base cabinet right there. It's 18 inches wide. And then my upper cabinet right here. So I've got 4 doors to build. Before I started the cabinet project, I put together some shop drawings, and kind of helps you figure out what sizes to cut things if you've got it dimensioned out. Once I had the shop drawings done, I could make my cut list right there. That kind of shows the size of all the parts that I've got to make. And these doors that I'm going to build right here are going to be panel doors. They're not going to be raised panel doors, just panel doors. So I've got the stiles right there and the rails right there. For the panels, I'm going to use 1/4" MDF oak veneer. And so that's what I'll be doing. The doors that I'm going to build will have 3/4" solid oak stiles and rails. So I decided to buy a set of cope and stick router bits. Some people would call them stile and rail router bits. These are carbide tipped. They're pretty high quality. It cost me about 75 bucks to get the set. One thing about it, this is an 1.5" Rockwell router, quarter cable. And it came with this base plate on it, and the base plate's got a groove in there for a collar and things like that, so it's not big enough. It won't fit there, so I made a couple of base plates to swap it out while I'm running these bigger router bits. I've tried it, and the horsepower is adequate. It's not overly powered, but it does work. I'd call this the stick, or the it's the bit that goes around the inside of the panel, and this would be the cope bit right here, and that's what you'll use to cut the end grain of the rails. And it's all ball bearing guided. So there's a ball bearing down there in the middle of that one. Another ball bearing right there that basically just follows the wood. Well, before I start running my router bits down this nice lumber, probably about $40 worth of oak sitting right there. Wanted to get the router bits set up right, and this bit right here, oops, got her upside down there, cuts that profile. Hope you can see it okay. And this router bit right here cut this other profile. It's kind of hard to see. Get it out here where, yeah, right there. Okay, so that's cut the end grain profile on the rail. And you put them just like that. They go together and fit nicely. This is what the joint looks like assembled. And of course it's too long and everything, but these are just test pieces. If you got your router set up correctly for depth, then when you run your finger over that joint, you basically shouldn't feel any hump or bump in it at all. If there's a minor hump or bump in it, you can sand that down later. But that's how the joints will go together. And when we actually assemble the door, that'll be just a glue joint, and we'll clamp it together. You can see down there the groove for the 1/4" MDF. Well, I continue to experiment with this a little bit. I've cut the stile side on this edge of this board and that edge of that board. This side of the board, I use something called climb cutting, which is where you'll take the router spinning like this and go really backwards up the board. The part about that that's a little bit scary is the router will grab and try to pull itself along, where if you're using it in a normal fashion, you'll start here and go this way, and you're working against the rotation of the bit. There's benefits to both. The controllability of running the router from left to right is a lot better, but it will chip the edge, that fine edge of that wood a little bit occasionally, And that's what I found on this side over here. So I'm kind of come up with a way of using climb cutting. I'm going to go from that end this way and then get most of the stock off and then turn around and clean it up by coming back left to right again. So we'll see how that goes. Make sure you have your hearing protection in and your safety glasses on when you're doing this. So that left me with a nice sharp crisp edge right there. Ideally, you know, it'd be nice to be doing this on a router table or better yet on a shaper. But I don't have those things, don't have room for those things in my shop right now either. So it's really important that all your cuts are perfectly square on all the ends. I've got this really old Rockwell power miter saw. It's 9 inches. Just about everything nowadays is 12 inches. This saw is probably a 1980s vintage, but it keeps working very well for me. So I've got this board marked out 24 3/8 to that mark right there. I'm going to take this power miter box and just cut it square. Again, having safety glasses and ear protection in place. So I want to get as much width out of this 1x6 piece of oak as I can. So I've put a mark right on the dead center of it between those two edges. So there's right dead center in the board. And I've got my rip fence set up on the table saw, so that I should be ripping that point. Any discrepancy I can take care of on a joiner at a later time. So the final width of my doors wants to be about 15 7/8. So I've made a mark on the sawhorse there and there and brought my stiles into alignment. And when I do that, then I just measure between that edge and that edge, and that's the length that I want to cut to make my rails. And I want to measure between there, and there. If I do, I'm going to be too short. So it's that raised shoulder right there that I've got to measure. And so I'll be measuring that and cutting that over at the miter box, and then we'll come back to this. So getting the rail or the coat bit to match up with the stile or the stick bit is a touchy thing to do. It's got to be just right. I saved this little scrap of wood from my profile there that I cut, and the rails, tongue of the rail's got to fit into that square right there. So using that piece and lining that up right there, just exactly perfect. I think that I've got it right, so we're going to try a test cut and see. You've got to be careful cutting the end grain of these rails. The reason is that router bit has a ball bearing pilot right there. You can see it, and if you're not careful, that ball bearing sits right where that groove is plowed in there, and that ball bearing pilot will fall into that vacant spot and undercut your rail. You can see what happens there at each end as that ball bearing pilot falls into that groove. And I'm using this test piece to illustrate that for you. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make a little bit of a jig here. I cut these pieces of pine that are going to fit into that groove. Another one right there. Going to go into there. And then I'm going to anchor those pieces of pine down to the edge of that jig so that those the pine will infill that groove, and the ball bearing pilot then will follow that and not damage the rails. So I've got my jig built to use my router bit on the end grain of the rails. And what it's going to do is it's going to keep the router, the ball bearing pilot, from falling into those grooves that are already cut, and then cutting wildly at the start and the finish of those pieces. So right there you can see, took some pieces of white pine and made a little piece that will fit into the groove right there. I can pull that forward, bring it out right even with the edge of the jig, and then clamp it down back there and then run the router bit across the end. So we'll try that and see how it works. So we got a hearing and eye protection on. You can see how it blows out the end of it a little bit right there. I don't know if that'll be an issue or not. Might be able to just take my knife and trim that up, but we'll see how it fits here in a minute. So I don't know how well you can see this or not, but this is my test piece that I just pulled out of the jig. And pretty flush right there. And you can see that the groove lines up pretty well there. And all in all, I'm happy with it. The perceived miter joint right there looks pretty good on both ends of it. So I'm ready to go ahead and cut all 4 of my ends, 8 cuts total with a router, and then I'll split it down the middle, and that'll complete my top and bottom rails. So I've got the ends milled on all 4 of the top and bottom rail assemblies. I've got to take it over to the table saw and rip it right down the middle. And at that point, basically all the stiles and rails will be done, other than truing them up a little bit with a joiner. And then we'll be into making the panels. Well, just back from the table saw where I cut all the bottom and top rails in 2. And you see those 3 doors there. This one I've got dry fit up a little bit. Really happy with it. It turned out just great, I think. To the place where we've got to figure out the size of the panel and then cut the panels, put the panels in the groove, and then glue it up. Just to review a little bit here, we've taken and cut that profile on the edges of both the stiles and the rails. And then we've cut that profile, called the cope, in the ends of the rails. And they fit together very nicely.